And this might kind of feel like just a reused topic, but I promise you it's not. So Isaiah Stewart apparently will be available on the trade market. This actually does come from Michael Scotto of Hoops Hype, who is an NBA insider. So it is pretty reliable information. So Czar, feel like we've talked about this for maybe the past 2 years. What are your thoughts on this report that he may be available in the trade market? And do you think if the Pistons are offered something pretty decent, would they be willing to move him?
I don't. We talked about. I've talked about like untouchables on this team and everything like that, and how there really is no untouchable on a team that's not a contender. Um, and I really only believe there's a few true untouchables in the NBA. But in terms of what the Detroit Pistons are currently, I don't feel like Isaiah Stewart should be someone that they ever really consider trading. And I've said this a few times now. But I really do feel like his presence is irreplaceable on this team. It's something that one on the basketball court, the minute he checks in, it's evident that like
Mhm.
the pace of the game changes. Um, there is not a single player on this team that plays nearly as hard as Isaiah Stewart. Crashes the boards, your defensive anchor, really. Um, like, and he's able to provide spacing on offense. It hasn't been as much this season because they haven't used him in the 5 out scenario as much, but that's something that they do have the option to do. He's able to play make from the paint. I feel like there's not much you can ask of Isaiah Stewart that he can't do. Um, and also, I can swear, right?
Yeah.
He's just a fucking dog. Like that's really just what it is. He's like on the court. There's literally not a single player on an opposing team that can ever move Isaiah Stewart. Like he is an actual culture setter, and those are things that you can't replace. I think if the Pistons have 3 players that they cannot replace on this team, it is Cade Cunningham, it is Isaiah Stewart, and it is Asar Thompson. Those are 3 presences that absolutely cannot be replaced just because of how much they bring to this team. I feel as if Isaiah Stewart, if he were to be traded, it would be the very first big mistake of the Trajan Langdon era. And also, if I will add my own reporting onto this, I don't believe the Pistons will look to trade Isaiah Stewart this trade season. I don't see them really making much in terms of trade movement this season as well. I think this is a team that Trajan Langdon constructed that he wants to see how far they can go before really identifying what pieces, stay and what pieces go. Not to say they won't make any moves, but I don't expect them to move. And I would consider Isaiah to be a core piece of this team. I don't expect them to really move any core pieces anytime soon. If and when that does happen, it will be in the off season. But I think this is a team that if they do make moves at the deadline, it'll be pretty marginal. Um, Especially considering the success this team has had overall. They're not perfect, and they're not, in my opinion, they're not as good as they could be, but they have exceeded most fans' expectations early on, and they're playing competitive basketball, which was ultimately the goal. And I know they want to see internal development. So I don't believe Isaiah Stewart will be traded. And if he was, I do believe that would be a huge mistake.
Yeah, I think if they were to trade him, his presence immediately would be missed. There have been so many times this season where Jalen Duren hasn't really brought it defensively to the point where JB has the luxury of telling Stu, like, hey, can you, go bring some energy, give us some focus, box out. And I don't really expect, players to be locked in for a full 82 games, but I feel like every year we get a report from national reporters that the Detroit Pistons get trade offers for Isaiah Stewart all the time. And I think that says more about Stu as a player versus what the Pistons could possibly get. The fact that you've had contenders over the years like the OKCs, the Bostons, even Miami's to an extent, from what I've heard, um, they value him as a player, and I think to your point, he's such a culture setter. He was from a previous regime. Obviously, we're still paying for the draft pick protections. That's a whole other story for a whole other day. But he's one of your better defenders, one of your better rim protectors. Like I just saw a stat that he's tied with Jonathan Isaac with 30 blocks off the bench. Like that's a wild stat. Like 30 block shots in the first 25 games. He's having a career year from just blocking shots. Um I think trading him would be a mistake if the return isn't good, but I don't really know what his trade market is. I don't know if it's a first. I don't know if it's a rotational player, maybe a mid-level starter. But if you do trade him, you better get someone of equal value or maybe a little bit better, in my opinion, anyways.
Yeah, and also to add on to the reporting element of it, I believe Michael said that there are NBA executives who expect Isaiah Stewart to be available, and this is a tip in media for a lot of the viewers. When verbiage like expect and NBA executives expect, it means it is not from the Detroit Pistons or sources within the Detroit Pistons themselves. Um, so again, that's just something I'd look at. Not to say obviously he's a very credible reporter and everything like that. It's
Mhm.
just to say that you know other executives across the league would expect him to be available. That doesn't mean the Detroit Pistons are making him available. And
Yeah.
I do think in terms of return, yes, you would want a really good return for Isaiah Stewart, and ideally, if that ever were to happen, he would have to be like, in a package that if we talk about stars, like that would get you one back. Because I don't think Isaiah Stewart for a first round pick is really moving the needle much for this team. Um, and it's just because he's one of those players that I really feel like can't be replaced. I mean, you look at like a Malik Beasley, right? Like the culture buy-in that he has had thus far is something that, obviously the shooting has been lights out and has become a top 100 shooter as a Detroit Piston of all time. But it's the fact that he buys into this team and that they have this type of culture that like he can identify with and you can tangibly see the impact that he's had. I think Stewart is one of those players, but he's also a kind of a pillar of that culture. Um, I I really enjoyed watching Bruce Brown in Detroit. I think he is one of those types of culture guys that, really makes or breaks a team. Like, you know, I didn't think he really got the opportunity to showcase that in Detroit, but since he left Denver, you can tangibly see the impact that he has had, um, as his absence is really, really missed there. I look at a Dorian Finney-Smith in Dallas, when we talk about culture, like, those are the types of players. I mean, granted, Dallas did go to the finals last year, but they didn't win, right? Like, those are the type of play and they're still looking to trade for him also. That's also another thing, but again, players that just can't really be replaced, and I feel like Stewart is one of those players you just kind of have to keep around. And this is one of the things that Troy Weaver said a lot of things, but one of the things I think he said that was most accurate was when you talk about Detroit Pistons basketball and what that's supposed to look like, it starts and stops with Isaiah Stewart, and I believe that's really accurate.
Yeah, it's I feel like we talk about this at least every, as we get closer to the trade deadline since he's been here. We're going 4 years on this now that executives believe teams have offered. Wouldn't surprise me over the next 2 months if you start hearing like possible packages that the Detroit Pistons got offered for Isaiah Stewart because he's just a valuable player, in my opinion.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, I feel like that's why he, like you said, like that's why he gets, the offers and interest that he does across the league.